I don't care if you're his mother. Get out. Those words hit me like a slap I couldn't cry for. Rain blurred the cemetery, turning black umbrellas into a single moving shadow. My mascara ran down my cheeks in dark rivers. People I had known for years looked at me like I was a stranger. My son's wife stood between me and the graveside like a wall, lips pressed thin, perfectly composed. Perfume and white gloves, like she belonged at a gala, not at the end of my boy. They took me by the elbows and steered me away. Someone muttered, "Let's keep this respectful." My body moved on autopilot. My heart didn't. It was as if all the faces I trusted had layered over one another and become glass. They reflected everything back except the truth. That moment is where most people would stop the story, where they would leave me on the curb with tissues and condolences fading into the drizzle. But that is not where my life stopped. It's where everything began. If this video finds you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. City, town, even the time zone. And if you want to hear the whole truth of what happened to my son and how we nearly lost him, subscribe. I need witnesses who will listen. They called him David. He was mine. He had been a fidgety child, the kind who could disassemble a clock and reassemble it with extra springs. He had a penchant for late-night coding and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. He launched an app in his 20s that, for reasons I still don't fully understand, took off. One day he was fixing routers for small businesses. 3 years later, he was on panels, in interviews, and people wanted to be photographed with him. He never let it change him the way you fear money will change people. He still called on Sundays. He still laughed too loud at bad jokes. Then Jessica walked into a charity auction with a story. She wore a pale blue dress and moved like it had been cut for someone fragile. Her story was thin as tissue. Orphaned, years volunteering with kids, a charity that fed the hungry in Romania. She said it so easily that the room leaned in. David leaned in. They both bid on the same lot, a painting done by a community center. He made a joke about overpaying for art, and she smiled with teeth that were too white. He bought it and insisted she keep it. The courtship was a dream written on someone else's paper. Romantic dinners, carefully placed Instagram posts, posters of a couple who looked like they had been assembled by a marketing firm. She was all empathy on camera, fundraisers, speeches, sponsored posts. Off camera, she was attentive in a way that made my son glow. She listened when he rambled about server architecture. She ordered things for his apartment that made it smell faintly of lavender and citrus. They married in 9 months. I swallowed my unease. Mothers are allowed to worry. Mothers are also told to trust their children. So when I saw the subtle things, her habit of steering conversations away from his family, the way she straightened his tie when his voice cracked, the way she asked about his will in the gentlest way possible, I told myself it was jealousy dressed as caution. But then the little things became patterns. A miscarriage claimed on a crisp October morning. She wore a discreet veil of grief and the sympathy flowed. 2 weeks later, David was on the phone with a lawyer and left another signature on an updated will. The man who had never taken a will seriously signed a document naming her the primary beneficiary of everything. "That's just how it is now," he told me when I asked, as if the world had shifted under his feet and he was too dizzy to explain. Ryan was supposed to be a buffer, a childhood friend, the sort of man who'd been with David through skateboards and breakups. He was a reliable laugh at Thanksgiving, a godfather-type figure. He was also the key to a friction that didn't make sense until later. Ryan's eyes shifted in a certain way when Jessica was near. At first, it was easy to dismiss as protective friendship. Later, it would look like complicity. I began to notice the quiet manipulations. Once at a family dinner, she asked, casually and too closely, "How close are you to his accounts, Margaret? Does he still take your advice?" Everyone laughed. I did not. The laugh hurt like a sharp stone in the mouth. You learn to rationalize the things you don't want to be true. Then there are the things you can't rationalize. Helen had been a private investigator for most of her life. Now retired, she lived 2 blocks away and fed pigeons with the steady hands of a woman who had watched strangers fall apart and stay together in equal measure. When I described my unease, how the perfume seemed to change the way my son spoke to me, how he was calling less, how there were small bruises that he said were from sports, Helen didn't say what I wanted. She said what she needed to. Run a background check. It's cheap. At least you'll know. It sounds small, a background check. It was not courage. It was curiosity dressed as a favor, which felt like a safer sin. Helen called in favors, the kind only old PIs can call. A clerk here, an ex-colleague there. She had an old network, emails and dusty files. The report came with pages of dead ends, and then something that melted the air out of my chest. No birth certificate in the town Jessica named. A school listed in another state that had no records. A series of names that didn't quite match up. When I asked Jessica gently once, over coffee she had brought to the kitchen bench, steam making halos under the light, about the orphanage she mentioned, she smiled. "I don't like talking about it," she said. "It's complicated. It isn't important." Her hand was warm when she touched my son's. He had that same smile of someone who forgives and forgets. He had always been more trusting than his mother. Then Ryan died. They said he died in a motorcycle crash. The funeral was small, and there were photos with too much light over his face. 2 weeks later, according to Helen's notes, a new will surfaced again. I remember the sentence of it as if engraved on my ribs. "In the event of my death, all assets to Jessica Carter." The lawyer's stamp seemed to thud in my ears when I saw it. I called Patricia at the medical examiner's office because she was a friend who owed me candy bars and had once promised to watch my back. Patricia was cautious. "We can't release everything," she said, "and there'll be an investigation." I wanted to scream. I wanted to say, he was my son's friend. They were close. Is there any salt in the glass of this story? She told me to be patient. Patience is a kind word for death. It is a luxury I couldn't afford when I started finding notes. Post-its with odd phrases like bitter taste and skip 2 days and he forgets dinner. There were entries in David's calendar for tea with no names filled in. He began losing weight, though he told me the startup stress had him skipping meals. He grew pale, and his pulse sometimes thudded like a trapped animal. Once he woke in the middle of the night shaking and insisted he dreamed of falling through floors. He laughed it off the way men do, quick, embarrassed. I went to the doctor with a list of symptoms. The physician frowned and mentioned cardiac arrhythmia and electrolyte imbalance in a voice that slid along the edges of my chest like cold water. He asked about medication. David took nothing regularly. He had never been ill in the old concrete ways. He smoked a little when anxious. He drank sometimes when clients finished big deals. But he was not dying. When I told Patricia about these episodes, she gave me a look I'd seen on bodies and files. The look of someone parsing the living for hints of the dead. "Could be a toxin," she said carefully. "Certain compounds result in cardiac issues, Digitalis-like effects, but that's big to say." She would not say more, and she wouldn't give me the tests. Evidence needs a reason to be searched. I began sleeping badly. I would wake in the dark, the house holding its breath. I would dial his number and listen to the hum on the other end that meant someone else was on the line. He would answer with a voice like a man trying to hide a bruise. "I'm fine, Mom. It's just work. It's just so much." There was a text one night that made my blood rearrange itself. "Keep your mouth shut," it read. No name, No punctuation, just curt terror on a small screen. I stood on the porch of my house and reread it until my thumbs cramped. The only person I knew who refused to threaten in a direct voice was my son. He would never have sent that to me, not ever. Helen stopped by with more papers. She had a way of moving with certainty that made anything feel less frightening. In her envelope were receipts, hotel stays under different names, plane tickets to cities I had barely heard of, and a signature that matched Jessica's social media handle, but not a birth name. She had traced bank transfers to shell charities and a string of small corporate entities that, taken together, drew a spiderweb. "She's a pro," Helen said softly. "Or at least she knows enough to look like one." I wanted to call the police then. I wanted to hand everything to Detective Rodriguez and hear a badge reassure me that people like Jessica got booked and the world zipped right back together. But I had learned, slowly and painfully, that police departments are overwhelmed and evidence can look flimsy when you've only got suspicions and documents. You have to be precise. You have to have proof that won't crumble under cross-examination. Proof is a needy thing. So I stepped outside what was comfortable. I did not walk into illegal territory with a swagger. I moved like someone drowning who learns one useful thing about calm. If you stop fighting the current, you can hear where it pulls. I started watching. It began with the driveway. I would park a block away and watch the house, David's house before she moved in, where lights would go out and then on at odd hours. I would take photos of cars parked there late at night. I hired Helen to sit in a car with binoculars and a thermos. She called me the next morning and said she had seen Ryan pull into the driveway, stay 30 minutes, and leave. He hadn't been in town for weeks, according to friends. Small things began to congregate like birds on a telephone wire. A package delivered to an address and a name that matched one of Jessica's aliases. A man in an old coat who looked too comfortable standing on the corner. A voicemail on David's phone that had been deleted, only fragments left in the air. Once, when I visited under the cover of a lunch invitation, Jessica poured me tea. She was practiced at domestic precision, doily, saucer, a cup that turned the light. I smiled like a fool and sipped. It had a bitter edge I couldn't quite name. I set the cup down politely. "Too strong," I lied. She laughed the way someone who knows they are being judged might laugh. The next day, I found a sticky note in David's study. He likes it weak, she likes it strong. It was in his handwriting. It read like a clue. Everything swung into sharper focus the night I came home to find David on the couch, shaking. The color had bled out of him, and his lips looked like paper. His skin was clammy. He mumbled that he felt faint, and then he was silent. I called 911. They came with a kind of mechanical efficiency that felt like salvation. In the ER, machines hummed and lights were too bright. He watched me with features too exhausted to be angry. "Maybe you've been poisoned," Patricia whispered when she put her hand on my shoulder in the hospital corridor. She didn't say it as accusation. She said it as an observation with sharp edges. "No," I heard myself whisper, then louder to the ceiling. "No, not that." Patricia's face did not change. "We can't say that without testing," she reminded me. "But the pattern, if you wanted a theory, digitalis-like compounds fit. It would affect his heart rhythm. It would be subtle at first, then worse. But please, this is speculation." Speculation is a dangerous thing, too. It can be the beginning of a case or the end of your credibility. I knew how this looked. A vengeful mother seeing conspiracies in every teacup. I also knew what it felt like to stand frozen next to a man who might be slipping into a world where sleep didn't come back. David, to his credit, was stubborn and luminous. He refused to be a victim in front of me. He joked about hospital food and called his assistant. He signed forms that made me queasy because signing things under pressure is a kind of weakness people exploit. Later, I learned he'd updated financial access, giving Jessica power of attorney for certain accounts. He claimed it was a temporary measure while he was traveling more. The day-to-day decisions kept sliding away like pebbles down a stream. One night, I received a message that read like a threat disguised as a warning. "You are making a mess, Margaret. Stop poking." It was Boolean, unadorned. I considered forwarding it to Detective Rodriguez. I considered burning the phone. I considered everything and did almost nothing because making a move felt like a trap. There comes a corner in some lives where passivity is the same as consent. I didn't want the consent. I met with a woman in a coffee shop with a napkin full of notes and a lifetime of watching people lie. Helen handed me plans, simple, clumsy things that read as desperation but were edged in method. "If you can get in, get proof," she said. "Photograph, don't touch. If you can't, wait and let us work with what we have." Her voice was steady as a metronome. "You can't go to jail, Margaret, not for evidence. But if your son is dying, then the law will have to sort out where the blame lies." I carried the weight of everything like a borrowed coat. It fit awkwardly, sleeves too long. I knew I was crossing a line. I knew what kind of person tends to get arrested for trespassing. The parent so terrified they've forgotten the law is a thing other people use. I tried to imagine the clean edges of doing this by the book. There were no clean edges. There were only waiting rooms and more time for a steady plan to become a plan to finish a person. The final nudge was a text with 2 words: "Tonight, alone." It arrived at 2:13 a.m. A photo followed. The front door of the house, illuminated by streetlight, a shadow of someone stepping into the doorway. The text didn't say who would be there. I did not sleep. That night, I put on a coat not heavy enough for comfort and light enough to move in. I sat in my car a block away, hand on the wheel, heart loose in my throat. Helen sat beside me with binoculars and a thermos of coffee gone cold. The street smelled like rain and oil and that particular kind of city loneliness that happens when people are awake and pretending they're not. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Helen asked. Her voice wasn't moralizing. It was practical. It was anchored. "Yes," I lied. Or maybe I said no. The porch light clicked on at midnight. A sedan rolled into the drive, stopped, idling. It was Jessica's car. There were faint stickers on the bumper that matched photos I'd seen. A figure in a heavy coat slipped from the driver's side. For a half second, the shadow looked like Ryan. For a half second, the world teetered. Then it wasn't Ryan. It was someone else. My chest hollowed. "You could be making a mistake," Helen said. "You don't understand," I said. "My son is there." The house was quieter than I'd imagined it would be. Inside, voices, muffled, directionless. I crept as quietly as a woman who has spent a lifetime knowing when to be seen. The door was unlocked. Of course it was unlocked. That, I thought, is how things that seem arranged usually are. The trap is kindness. It took a breath, and my hands were inside the house. Fingers on countertops that smelled faintly of citrus and a cleaner that tried very hard to mask something else. I told myself I wasn't there to break anything, just to photograph, just to see. The kitchen was staged, a tea tin on the counter, a kettle sitting like a small engine, a drawer half open with a leather-bound notebook peeking out. I reached for my small camera, the one Helen insisted on me carrying, and aimed. What I found inside the tin made my stomach drop. There were dried leaves, like tea, but the edges of some leaves were jagged, not the round kind you buy at the supermarket, something brittle and dark. I thought of Patricia's cautious words and the softness of those clinical phrases. I turned my camera on and clicked. 1 photo. 2. My hands trembled. There was a small vial tucked behind a tin, sealed, the kind of thing you might find in a lab drawer or a perfume cabinet. The light caught it, and the liquid inside shivered like amber. My mother trained me to keep my hands away from unknown things. I obeyed that lesson with difficulty. I took a photograph of the vial, feeling the walls of the house shrink in a way I had never felt before. So safe and so dangerous all at once. That leather-bound notebook had a page peeking out. I did not touch it. I did not need to. I slid my camera lens in and read with the zoom. And there, in a handwriting that looked too careful, were names and dates and a small notation. Will revised, favors arranged. My throat closed. For a moment, the house held its breath with me. The only sound was the kettle clicking, as if someone had just turned it on somewhere in the other rooms. Then the front door lock clicked. I froze. The dog barked in the neighbor's apartment. A footstep that wasn't mine moved across the floor, the kind of step people take when they are either careless or comfortable. I turned my head slowly and felt the blood drain from my face. Someone had come home. I did not prepare a line to say. I had not rehearsed this scene in my head with an ending that involved anything other than the camera's shutter. My heart ran to the base of my throat, and I understood something I had been denying. If I was wrong, the law would not be kind. If I was right, then whatever happened next would not be contained to our little family. I tucked the camera into my coat, palms sweating through the fabric, and moved toward the nearest exit. I intended to leave without being seen. I intended to go home and call Helen and let the professionals take over. But that exit passed under the darkened hallway where voices gathered, 2 voices, low and urgent, like a tide meeting a cliff. One of them was Jessica's. Her voice was silk with a blade inside. I could hear the edge. The other was Ryan's, or someone who sounded like him. They were close enough for me to hear the words between them, words I had hoped to never hear. "If he goes tonight, we enact Plan B," one voice said. "He'll take the tea. He'll think it's just sleep. He won't know." "I'll handle it," Jessica answered, the syllables precise. "We need the will finalized. Everything must follow the script." My hands went cold. The camera in my pocket seemed to vibrate against my ribs. I couldn't tell you which part of me moved first, fear or something like gravity. I reached for the door and stepped into the hallway. The wall smelled like cooking oil and something else that made my throat tighten. Then a shadow passed the room at the end of the hall. A figure entered the kitchen, looking directly at the counter where the tea tin sat. My camera pressed against my side like a heartbeat. "Hello," I said, because I had to say something or I would dissolve into the floor. They turned. Jessica's face was a bright oval of composure. Ryan, no, it was the man who had driven in earlier, looked surprised in that way practiced men do when being interrupted. For a sliver of a second, everything suspended. Then Jessica smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Margaret," she said, the name a scalpel. "This is a surprise. Come in out of the rain." I had to decide, in a second, whether to tell the truth or invent a lie. My mouth moved before my brain caught up. I was bringing David his favorite tea. I thought, "You should not be here," she said. Her voice was steady. The rest of her moved like someone who had practiced this scenario. "You are making a scene. This is his house, not yours." She came closer. There was perfume, cedar, and something sweet. People who had watched me leave my son's funeral had been right. I didn't belong. But I had photos. I had a vial. I had a will proof to pull like an impossible rabbit out of a hat. I had reasons. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and beneath that, there was a fierce animal clarity. I wanted to shake the world until it made sense. I wanted to tell them before they could finish whatever they called Plan B. "Where were you that night, Margie?" Ryan asked softly, as if questioning someone who might be starting to unravel. His smile was thin. He referred to me by a diminutive that used to be fond, but now sounded mocking. I held the camera like a talisman. Helen's words echoed. "Photograph, don't touch." In the kitchen, the kettle clicked again. The light in the window made everything look like a stage. They were so practiced at the domestic that it made my skin crawl. I had come to expose a pretense. It felt absurd and righteous at once. As if someone downstairs in the house had flipped a switch, the front door opened and then closed again, a sound like a distant clock. I clutched the camera, and my fingers found the small red button that starts recording without me thinking. There is no courage like desperation. I felt it bloom and flatten me in the same motion. I had taken one reckless step across the line. I had no idea the legal and moral tightrope I had just set my foot upon. The room's air tightened, the moment stretched like elastic. My chest beat fast enough to sweat. I realized then that I was not the only person with secrets in that kitchen. "Margaret, please," Jessica said, voice honeyed. "If you're worried, let's talk somewhere else. Not here, not now." She reached for the tea tin as if to close it, to erase the evidence into ordinary domesticity. Her fingers brushed the metal, and the world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing. I pressed the camera closer to my chest and heard the distinct click that meant the memory card was filling, that the mechanism was recording life in small files that could be played back later, judged later. I had crossed the line. I had no idea what would come after that click. But I knew one thing with a clarity that steadied me. I could not go back to standing on rainy curbs with mascara streaking down and people looking away. If my son was in danger, then the law would have to answer for what I had to do. At the sink, the kettle screamed a high, anxious note and then died. The house exhaled. Outside, rain thinned to a silver ribbon. My hands did not stop shaking. I raised the camera a sliver to catch the moment when Jessica's face changed from hospitality to calculation. The shutter whirred. The recording light wavered like a heartbeat. Footsteps came up the stairs, fast. Footsteps came up the stairs, fast. They hit the kitchen like a drum. I fumbled, the camera a cold stone against my sternum. Jessica's smile froze into something thinner, an outline of the mask she wore so well. The man with her moved with a slurred gait, and for a second my mind tried to patch together what my ears were telling me. This wasn't Ryan. Later we'd learn why that mattered. The decoy, the staged identities. But in that kitchen, my brain only knew panic and the sense that I'd just shoved myself into a nest of vipers. "Margaret," the man said, voice thick. He looked at me with the mild confusion of someone interrupted from a comfortable script. "You're not supposed to be here." Jessica stepped forward like a chess player moving a queen. "You're making his house," she began, all porcelain calm. Her hand hovered over the tea tin as if to close the lid and erase what it contained. My fingers found the red record light again. The camera hummed softly, recording. I had no right to record. I had no right to be inside. I had no right to hope that this small device would turn suspicion into hard truth. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt like letting my child march quietly into a coffin. "Don't touch anything," I said, though it was more prayer than command. "Who's going to believe you?" Jessica asked. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. She laughed then, a thin sound that crawled under my skin. "You're his mother. People take your tears and pat your hand. You think the law will side with a woman who sneaks into houses in the middle of the night?" Then the other voice, this one not faked, cut in. "Maybe we should call the police," the man said. He sounded genuine in his hesitation. For a sliver of a moment, I believed salvation had arrived in the shape of a patrol car. Jessica's face changed in the way a mask does when the actor remembers a new line. "No," she said sharply, "not now, not over this." Her eyes flicked to the man as if to say, "Do what we've rehearsed." I didn't know at that second that the man she relied on had a name I would later learn, Thomas Wheeler. He was a transient with a wound in his life that had made him easy to lead and easier to buy. He had been brought in as a prop, a fake Ryan when it suited their story, an expendable body for the theater they were crafting. He had been paid to look like the person everyone expected at the right moment. Later, under questioning, he'd say he didn't know the difference between right and wrong when he was hungry and vulnerable. That night, in my kitchen, he looked like a man who had been asked to play a part he did not understand. The camera caught their hands. It caught the way Jessica's fingers brushed the edge of the tea tin like a conductor tapping a cymbal. It caught the small, deliberate movements, two people speaking in shortcuts and code. It caught the line, Plan B. My throat closed. I pressed the camera harder into my chest, recording. There was the soft scrape of chairs, the quiet clink of a spoon against porcelain, the breath you get from someone about to perform, and then words that dropped like stones. "If he goes tonight, we enact Plan B," Jessica said in a low voice. "The T, he thinks it's just sleep, he won't know. The will is signed, or it will be, after we—" The man, Thomas, murmured in agreement. His voice was uncertain, like a man repeating lines he'd only been given minutes before. "I'll make it look natural." "Do it right this time," Jessica said. "No ambulance calls, no tests that show nothing. We do the T. He sleeps. We call it a tragic heart event. It's clean." There it was. Clean, calculated. The world in that kitchen rotated toward a logic I'd seen only on the pages of novels. Take the thing that sustains, the ritual of a loved one handing you a cup, and turn it into weaponry. I could have run. I could have made a scene loud enough that the neighbors came out and the police were forced to take sides. I could have thrown the tea tin on the floor and watched the lie spill into pieces. Instead, I did something cowardly and brave at the same time. I kept recording. I let the machine be the witness. I let the law, imperfect and slow, have an unblinking eye to examine. When Jessica mentioned that the will is signed, those words hit like a physical force. Days earlier, I'd photographed that very will peeking from a filing drawer. It had been updated in a legal office visit David said was a routine cleanup. He had signed with a steady hand because he believed the person beside him when she called him Angel and reminded him of Charity. He had trusted, and that trust had become a seal in a document. I pressed the camera lid closed just for a second and told myself this would be enough. That small glass rectangle could turn into something the police would carry into a courtroom and make impossible to ignore. I had no idea then about the legal thorns, about whether courts would accept what I had obtained by unlawful means. I only knew the sound of my son's breath being borrowed. "You're going to ruin him," Jessica said, almost whispering. There was no sympathy in it. It was arithmetic. It was counting. "Not this time," the man said. "We don't need him gone. We just need him—" He hesitated, and I realized what the pause meant. Their plan didn't have to end in death. It only needed to cut him out, surgically and irreversibly. I stepped forward then. My recorder was in my hand, and my voice was the only sharp thing in the room. I told the truth. "You don't get to do this to him," I said. "To David, you can't." Jessica's hand flashed. She reached for the toaster as if to signal a normal household interruption, and in that move, she shoved her elbow toward the tea tin. The motion was so quiet that at first I didn't register it. The cup that had been within her reach slid, the kettle hissed, and the liquid inside the vial caught the light in a way that made me want to look away. Then, sirens. It was the sound of my life shifting. Not far away, as if someone had called for help and the pavement itself had responded, the high keening of an emergency vehicle threaded through the rain. I don't know who called them. I don't know if a neighbor phoned when they saw an unfamiliar car. Maybe Helen, watching from down the block, had played the only card that felt like responsibility. Maybe she had whispered into a phone and said the right thing. I can't prove it now, but the sirens filled the night and snapped like a wire. Jessica's face tightened. She moved to the sink, hands steady and practiced. "Think of the image," she said, as if to herself. "Think of the story. We can't have an ambulance coming, calling. We need quiet." I held the camera out then, like a talisman, like a weapon. "I'm calling 911, I said. "Someone set to hurt my son." The constitutional right to be heard sounded different when it came from an elderly woman videotaping in a kitchen. The man moved between me and the phone as if protecting something fragile. I saw his guilt in the way he avoided my eyes. I saw the way Jessica's fingers tapped the counter, calculating. I pressed the speaker with shaking hands and said the words into my phone. "Please, my son is in danger. Please send an ambulance to 43 Maple. He's ill and there are threats." My voice was steadier than I felt. It had to be. If the call faltered, everything might falter. 911 listened. They asked for the address. They asked whether anyone was armed. They said they'd send someone. I held up the camera while I spoke, and I could see Jessica's jaw twitch. She mouthed a curse. The man looked at me in a new way, betrayal and fear braided together in his features. By the time the police car lights cut through the rain and painted the kitchen floor in blue and red, the scene had already moved. Jessica had tried to push the tea tin toward the back of the cabinet, hands quick and calm. She had the look of a woman who'd rehearsed emergency PR more than empathy. Fluster on the surface, calculation beneath. The paramedics came in measured pairs. They checked David's medical bracelet and asked for his name. I felt ridiculous standing there, a woman with no official credentials, holding a camera like a flag. They found him in the bedroom, semi-conscious, pale and trembling. The medics worked fast. They put him on a cot and lifted him as if he were a fragile object. In the hallway, Jessica followed, her composure schooled in public. She leaned close to the paramedic and whispered a plausible history, professional and efficient. "He has cardiac issues," she said, voice low, the sort of phrase that wraps itself in authority. They accepted it. They loaded him into the ambulance. The ride to the ER was metallic and long. I sat in the passenger seat of Helen's old sedan, her hand across mine, and watched the back of the ambulance recede. The recorded file on my camera felt like evidence and like a confession. I wanted to hand it over, but I also feared what would happen once the police had it. Would they throw it out because I had crossed a line? Would a defense attorney say my entry negated everything? Detective Sarah Rodriguez arrived at the hospital a short time later. She had the patient detachment of someone who'd seen the weight of families and the wear of time. She listened to my breathless accounting and read the small print of the facts. She took my photographs with the sort of practiced care a person uses to collect delicate things. She gave me a look that was part cautionary and part permission. "Do you have that recording?" she asked. I handed her the camera. "It's on here," I said. I didn't mean to record it, but it's on there. It has them saying." She didn't finish my sentence. Instead, she took the device like a juror taking a single piece of compelling evidence and put it into the hands of the forensics techs. That act felt like a small mercy. It also set a complicated chain into motion. I would learn later about chain of custody and admissibility, about why what I had done could both save my son and complicate the prosecution. In the ER, the machines hummed with indifferent efficiency. My son lay under a bright flood of light, an IV in his arm, monitor singing numbers like a heartbeat translated into beeps. He looked smaller than I did. Illness has a way of shrinking people you love into vulnerable things. He opened his eyes and looked at me with a softness that made the room tilt. "Mom," he whispered. The word was almost ordinary. "What are you doing here?" "Keeping you alive," I said. The truth in that sentence was immediate and uncomplicated. We rode the legal tides in the days that followed. Jessica was arrested at the hospital that night, charged with attempted homicide and fraud. The photo of the vial and the tea tin were bagged and logged. The recording, the one that made my hands shake when I watched it on a forensic bench, was cataloged. I watched it and felt both vindicated and terrified. They heard the words, too. We enact Plan B. The T. We had enough to arrest, Detective Rodriguez told me, but not everything to convict. Police work is arithmetic of risk. Probable cause is a different beast than beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense moved quickly. They attacked the method of retrieval like wolves sharpening teeth. Illegal entry, the press blared later, quoting an attorney with a flourish. Coerced recording, they said. My actions, they said, might make the evidence unusable. They painted me as a frantic mother who'd crossed the line. They asked whether enough of the prosecution's case rested on evidence that might be thrown out. They also spun a narrative Ronnie the defender thrives on. Jessica had been a caring partner, a devoted wife, a woman who'd suffered losses. They played the miscarriage as a humanizing scar. They suggested duress, that she had been manipulated by Ryan, by circumstance, by pressures that would drive anyone to desperate measures. The legal theater is efficient like that. Reduce the monsters to victims, complicate moral clarity. Bail was granted for Jessica. That was a low, cold moment for me. She walked out of the courthouse with hands wrapped around a coffee cup and a look of someone who'd rehearsed freedom. She hugged a friend and smiled for cameras. The system's politeness sits at the intersection of law and commerce, and justice sometimes looks like patience. David's doctors insisted on a battery of tests. Toxicology screens were ordered, blood panels run, and specialists called in. Patricia, ever the cautious friend at the ME office, worked with the team to expedite a pattern analysis. They tested for compounds that could create digitalis-like cardiac arrhythmias. The results were not simple. Some markers pointed toward exposure to substances that interfere with cardiac conduction. Others were ambiguous. That is the thing about modern forensics. It can illuminate and it can leave shadows. The prosecution strategy was to connect dots. The T10, the vial, the updated will, the recording, Jessica's pattern of aliases and fake charities, the transactions Helen had traced. Links, when joined, make a picture. The defense's strategy was to pick at the string. The entry was illegal, the recording had been made in a private space, the vial could have been planted, the will was updated by a competent, autonomous adult. Reasonable doubt is a potent weapon. Federal interest came like a new tide. Agent Maria Santos walked into the precinct like a fact with a badge. She was from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and her first words were crisp. "We need to look beyond the house," she said. "Charities, shell companies, cross-state transfers. If she's done this before, it's not a local matter, it's interstate. It falls under federal jurisdiction." Her arrival changed the scale of the investigation. Where the local detectives had been searching for motive and method, Agent Santos and her team had a different appetite: patterns, paper trails, bank routing numbers, and identity files. They traced donations that never reached beneficiaries. They followed wire transfers to fake foundations. They found names that matched Jessica's aliases bouncing between shell corporations. The web was bigger and uglier than I'd imagined. It wasn't only about one man and one cup of tea. It was about a pattern of deception that stretched farther than our county lines. Under Agent Santos, the investigation widened. She asked me painful questions. When did I first notice? Who did I tell? How had I come to the conclusions I did? She had a way of making an old wound into a map. We worked together, awkwardly at first, then with a sense of grim solidarity. I was not trained for this. I had been a nurse, a mother, someone who fixed dinner and helped when children scraped their knees. Now I sat in conference rooms and watched analysts draw arrows between bank accounts like cartographers tracing the paths of criminals. One breakthrough came when Helen's network found a client of one of Jessica's charities. A woman from another state had been scammed. The same pattern. A lonely donor convinced of a story, money transferred to a shell foundation, the foundation's funds diverted into the private accounts of people with names that kept shifting. That woman and another began to form a chorus. They were victims who had been waiting, in some cases for years, for someone to notice the pattern. The Bureau's financial team traced transfers to a company with a director who had used Jessica's email. The same director's name had been listed on paperwork for a firm used to buy flight tickets under the same alias. Each piece looked small by itself. Together, they began to look like a machine. Meanwhile, the prosecution faced a pivotal decision near the state bench, whether to rely on my recording and the break-in evidence as the center of their case. They would, but they'd also know defense attorneys with resources would file motions seeking to exclude as much as possible. They predicted the attacks, suppression motions arguing the recording violated privacy laws, motions to exclude evidence obtained by unlawful entry. The legal game would play out slowly and painfully. I sat through pretrial hearings feeling as if the world had been reduced to a stack of paper and the sound of lawyers' shoes on polished floors. Jessica's attorney argued that any confession or plan articulated in a room one might claim privacy over could not be admitted if obtained without consent. The judge listened with weary, careful attention. At one hearing, he asked me questions directly, as if testing whether my motives were pure or vengeful, manipulated by grief. I told him the truth. I was scared, and I had been pushed to the edge by a mother's instinct. The judge granted in part and denied in part. Some of my evidence would be allowed. Other parts would be scrutinized under rules that made me feel simultaneously protective and fragile. The recording? Well, it was complicated. It contained incriminating statements. The fact I had been present during the discussion put it in a gray area. The court allowed portions in, redacted others. It was a molehill of legal detail made into a mountain. But the other pieces, bank records, the vial itself, Helen's PI documents, the will, those were things the defense couldn't easily erase. The vial was sent to a private lab for analysis. The tea-tin was tested. Fingerprints, while partial, hinted at a narrative. That was the thing about accumulating evidence. It becomes a chorus. No single voice has to be perfect. Enough imperfect voices will form a story that holds together. Then came the undercover work that would finally bring the full picture into focus. Agent Santos coordinated with the state prosecutor to place an informant into the system. They used pretrial visitation to cultivate a thread. Jessica, awaiting trial and granted some limited visitation rights, would see people who were not what they seemed. The feds orchestrated a jail visitation where a woman posing as a sympathetic cellmate, a woman with a history of petty fraud who acted as someone who listened and let others talk, found Jessica in a quiet mood. What came next was both painful and necessary. The woman, recorded legally by federal standards, came back with tales of conversations in the visiting room. She'd seen Jessica flinch when certain subjects came up. She heard her say, in private, words that suggested a chronicity of deception, of identity shifting, and of a larger network involving recruiters who found vulnerable people like Thomas Wheeler and used them interchangeably as props or stooges. She'd also heard Jessica mention a man who managed transfers, someone with access to a back office and a talent for cleaning up records. The tapes from that jail room were devastating. They filled in blank spaces with texture and intent. Federal prosecutors used them to draft charges that went beyond attempted homicide, interstate fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The case ballooned, and with it, the resources directed at a woman who had once been described in local papers as a philanthropist with a sad story. Ryan, David's childhood friend, who had indeed been involved in their small social world, was part of the puzzle in a different, more complicated way. He had indeed died in the way our town had been told, a motorcycle crash with too many shining photos and too little verification. But the FBI followed the money and the messaging. They found payments to a man who claimed he'd helped stage the scene. They found an autopsy file with questions. They found later a man who'd been paid to stand in as Ryan at times when the real Ryan had chosen to disappear from public view. Truth is messy. Identity had been a commodity. Ryan's disappearance, once neatly packaged as tragedy, was entangled now with lies and manufacturing of sympathy that created financial traction. When Jessica and her co-conspirators finally sat in the federal dock, the air changed. The charges were weighty and specific: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and interstate transfer of fraudulently obtained funds. The attempted murder charge remained in the hands of the state prosecution, complicated by the issues surrounding the break-in and the recorded conversation. Both prosecutors had the same ultimate aim: hold the people accountable in whatever forum the law allowed. The trial was long and public and ugly in the way that truth gets ugly when dragged into courtrooms. The defense's narrative, duress, manipulation, a tragic woman trapped by fate, was performative and effective with the right audience. Jessica cried in open court once, a curtain of wet that softened some hearts. Her attorneys pushed hard on the parts of our case that were legally vulnerable: my unlawful entry, the recording in a private space, the vial's ambiguous test results. They made jurors consider whether a mother's grief had become a vendetta. But the prosecution had something crucial: patterns, paper, and multiple victims. They brought in the donors who had been swindled, the bank officers who traced the transfers, Helen to testify about the aliases, Patricia to explain cardiac effects in general terms without suggesting specific methods, Agent Santos to map the shell companies, and me to stand in the middle of the narrative and explain why I had broken a rule to save my summon. When the federal jury returned guilty on multiple counts, the room gasped with the peculiar hush of satisfaction and sorrow. Retribution in the form of a long sentence didn't bring Ryan back or make David unill, but it did something else. It declared that a pattern had been recognized and punished. Jessica received a life sentence at the state level for the most serious charges linked to her attempted murder plot, life without parole, while federal sentences for the fraud and identity theft stacked on top, ensuring she would not walk free. Some of the people who've read sensational headlines assume that trials always go a certain way: a villain, a fall, a neat ending. Real life is less tidy. Appeals were filed. The defense fought every angle, arguing the recording should have been suppressed because of the illegal entry. They argued that the jail informant's tape was tainted. They said some of the financial evidence was hearsay. I sat through hours of legal wrangling and felt my resolve waver. The law is not a straight line, and I learned to live with that ambiguity. But the jury's verdict stood, and in the days after, the house felt different. The house where my son nearly died felt both safer and scarred. David recovered slowly. He had setbacks, cardiac arrhythmias that required monitoring and therapy, nights when sleep wouldn't come and he would stare at the ceiling as if it might hold answers. He lost weight, not just from illness, but from seeing the world differently. He became cautious in ways he hadn't been before. Trust, once broken, is a thief that steals edges of people's lives. There were quieter, deeper victories. The funds that had been frozen by federal investigators were slowly disentangled. Some money could be traced and returned to victims, though the legal process trimmed the edges. David, with a clarity that surprised him and me, decided to steer his experience into something larger. He sold the house and used the proceeds to seed a nonprofit, an organization dedicated to helping people who had been scammed through the sort of romance and charity cons that had nearly killed him. He hired lawyers and counselors to assist victims in navigating the bureaucratic and emotional minefield of recovery. I became, in a way I never planned, a consultant. Victims called me and said, "We saw your story. We think we've been scammed." I spoke to them, sometimes over the phone in scratchy lines, sometimes across kitchen tables in houses where the air smelled of the same tea I had once trusted. My nursing instincts, watchful and steady, became useful in a different register. I helped people notice patterns, to ask questions, to find help. People ask if I forgive Jessica. The truth is complicated. Forgiveness is a verb that sometimes feels like a bargain with memory. I don't sit and pray for her. I don't celebrate her suffering. I recognize her as someone who did terrible things and was punished within the limits of our system. I have no appetite for vengeance, but I reserve a hard place in my heart for the right to be angry. Anger keeps you from forgetting what happened. Anger can also be a tool if you let it carve you into someone who helps others rather than someone consumed by hurt. We also had to reckon with consequences that didn't make for good headlines. My illegal entry created an ethical riddle. People asked, angrily, privately, in angry emails, why I'd broken the law. A lawyer friend told me it was the sort of moral calculus that older women make when the world doesn't offer adequate protection. Choose between law and life, and sometimes you'll choose life. The judge had considered my actions in pretrial motions, and while they complicated the state's attempt to present an airtight case, they didn't erase the other evidence. The legal system can be capable of balancing truths that sit uneasily together. Thomas Wheeler, the man who had been paid to play at being Ryan on certain nights, testified reluctantly. He told the court about hungry months and the smallness of choices when people offered money for a role. He had been coerced into participation by promises and need, and the court recognized that his culpability had nuance. He received a sentence that reflected his role as a pawn more than a kingpin. Time, but not the life sentence Jessica and her inner circle received. Later interviews with him painted the portrait of a man who'd been used and then abandoned by people who had no compunction about swapping bodies for stories. The fallout reached beyond our family. Agent Santos and her team used the case as a model to pursue similar networks. They uncovered other rings that preyed on trust. Con artists who cultivated apparent empathy, charities that were fronts, decoy grief staged to produce donations. The FBI produced materials, workshops, and guidance for law enforcement across multiple districts. They taught detection of pattern, of slight inconsistencies and backstories. The training didn't fix everything, of course. Scams adapt like organisms, but it helped. People often ask me if I regret what I did, the break-in, the recording, the nights I watched from the dark. It's a question posed by those who prefer moral clarity and simple rules. My answer is not neat. I regret the strain it placed on relationships and on my own soul. I regret the nights I lay awake, thinking of things I might have done differently. But I don't regret that I stopped a cup of tea from becoming a final silence for my son. When it comes to the shape of choices, some of them bruise the knuckles of our better angels. The last years have been about rebuilding in small ways. David left the startup world for work that had more meaning to him. He found a rhythm in advocacy and in counseling other survivors. He married again, eventually, to a woman who knew pieces of his story and didn't want to recreate them. He was careful about trust and generous about gratitude. He started the nonprofit that became his mission. He worked with banks and nonprofits alike to develop systems that made it harder for cons to thrive. I kept in touch with Helen until her hands were too shaky for binoculars and her eyes too tired for late-night stakeouts. She lives now in a small home with a garden she tends like a liturgy. Patricia spent extra hours at the ME office, helping design protocols when a death or suspected death intersects with potential criminal acts. Detective Rodriguez took promotions and sometimes called me to ask about outreach to local senior communities, people like me who are targeted for sympathy scams. Agent Santos became a friend, an unlikely ally across the gulf between citizen and federal agent. She taught me a vocabulary that made sense of spreadsheets and subpoenas. She also gave me the kind of plain talk I needed when the press wanted easy quotes and my life didn't fit neat lines. People often want the neat moral at the end. They want the villain punished, the hero vindicated, the world put back in its frame. But here's what I learned. Justice is loud and slow. It requires patience and the willingness to sit in small offices and argue over bank statements. It requires people who will turn evidence into narratives and who can live with the gray that comes from imperfect means used for an imperfect end. The funeral, the rain, the mascara, that day is a shard I carry. Being shoved out of my son's own funeral was humiliation carved in public. It made me small for a while, but it also made the work ahead inevitable. Some people think pride is what drove me back into the world. Pride played a role, but what drove me most was a maternal muscle that doesn't let the heart stop without making noise about it. We do not live in a world that hands us simple choices. We live in a web of people who can be charming and dangerous at once. I want people to watch my story and learn, but not to learn in a way that turns to fear and isolation. Learn to ask questions. Learn to cross-check stories that seem too tidy. Learn to call someone when something doesn't feel right. And one more thing, being a witness matters. I asked you at the start to drop your location in the comments. You did. I read them in the quiet hours. People writing from cities and small towns, from neighborhoods where grief and joy live side by side. Your comments mattered not just emotionally, but for the work we did afterward. People from different places sharing their own stories of deception helped the FBI see patterns that might have remained local and hidden. If there's a last note, if there's a grain I can leave you with, it's this. Love is not always soft. Sometimes love has to be sharp and awake. Sometimes it has to be a witness that refuses to be silenced. If you see something like this, tell someone. If you feel something in your pulse that tells you a story doesn't add up, listen to it. But listen to the law too. Work with authorities. Be careful. Be brave in ways that don't get you harmed. I'm not a hero. I'm a woman who loved a son and did what I thought would save him. I broke rules and I paid for it in sleepless nights and in the suspicions of some who didn't understand why I crossed lines. The law didn't always need me to be right. It needed evidence. It needed patience. It needed people like Agent Santos to turn a kitchen into a map of wrongs. Jessica is in prison now. Her face is still in the paper sometimes, but those photographs have the hollow quality of a public spectacle that's been drained of story. The bigger network she was part of has been dismantled, in part because of the work we did together. Law enforcement, prosecutors, victims telling their truths. The lives she touched and harmed won't be fully mended by sentences, but the wheel turned. My son lives. He breathes, laughs, argues, and sometimes flinches. He has scars he hides under neat shirts. He runs a nonprofit that helps people avoid the traps he'd fallen into. He speaks at conferences now about cybersecurity and about the human costs of scams. He hasn't forgiven everything that happened to him, but he has chosen to build something that helps others. That is perhaps his best revenge. He's taken the story, bent it toward repair, and walked forward. And me? I keep cleaning the house, making tea the way we like it, weak with a hint of lemon. I don't let strangers pour it for me. I teach people how to notice little things, the way a story is told, the urgency of a plea for money that begs rather than shows. I have a small list of resources I give to callers. I meet with community centers and librarians and make them understand that scams often begin with a performance, sadness staged, a photo of a child who may not exist, a charity that is a mirage. If you've watched this far, Thank you for sharing these minutes with a woman who stood in a kitchen with a camera and refused to look away. If my story helps one person be cautious and alive, then the sleepless nights have had some purpose. Share your story in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. If this resonated with you, if it made you think twice about a phone call or a donation, subscribe. We need people watching. We need people willing to be witnesses. I don't forgive the people who threatened my family with casual cruelty, but I've learned how to turn that anger into work for victims, for the vulnerable, for anyone who might one day sit with a tea tin and not know whether the tea is a ritual or a weapon. Keep your eyes open. Keep your voice loud enough for the right people to hear. And if you ever have to choose between law and life, choose life in a way that lets the law do its job afterward. This is what happened after my daughter-in-law thrust me out of my son's funeral. What happened next? The recording, the 911 call, the arrests, the federal case, the nonprofit, the convictions was messy and righteous and imperfect. It was the thing that saved him, and in saving him, we found a way to save others.